Thanks for being part of this again as we continue to take a look at the book of Numbers. I've enjoyed this. I hope you have. I think there's a lot in Numbers that we can learn. There's several things in what we're going to talk about today, and that's chapters 9 and 10 that we're gonna walk through a little bit. I was noticing as I looked at the videos, I was looking at something the other day online and noticed that each one of them seems to be getting a little bit longer. And so I'm going to try to reverse that trend today. Right, and we'll be the judge when we get done to see how well I did. But, you know, to be on your end, at least you can hit mute or fast forward and move on. But I'm just trying to I want to try to pare that down so we're not going, man, is he ever going to shut up? All right. The answer to that's no, by the way. But anyway, we're gonna move forward. I want us to start by taking a look at chapter 9. Again, we're anxious. I think we're anxious to get moving, and I think that the Israelites may be anxious to get moving. We're going to talk a little bit about the time frame again as we read this section, but we're stopping the action one more time here. So let's start in chapter 9, and let's just begin reading in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Let the people of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month, at twilight, you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its statutes and all its rules, you shall keep it. So Moses told the people of Israel that they should keep the Passover. And they kept the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so the people of Israel did. All right, we talked about this cycle. It's sitting right here on the board. I drew it up here earlier. That this cycle that we talked about last week of listening to God and responding. And that's the cycle that we hope that we find ourselves, right? We hope we find ourselves in that cycle where we hear what God has to say and we respond accordingly, right? We hear what God has to say and we're obedient. And we see that just in these first 5 verses. The Lord spoke to Moses, Moses spoke to Israel, Israel did it. That's the cycle. We're going to notice as we walk through the book of Numbers that this cycle does not always happen. And we're going to notice when it does happen and when it doesn't happen, and the things that happen in conjunction with that, right? We're going to notice this. All right. So, well, the first thing I want us to talk about just for a second is how long we've been here. Now, we've mentioned this before, but here it is. In the first month of the second year after they'd come out of the land of Egypt, they kept the Passover in the first month of the year they came out of Egypt. And matter of fact, in Exodus, I believe it's Exodus 12, when the Passover regulations are given, and when he talks about doing this all according to all of his statutes and commands, we can find them there. Now, some of these are also mentioned here in 9, a little bit later on, but these are the statutes. And when God speaks to Moses about the very first Passover, he says, this is going to mark the first of the year for you, right? This is going to be a new year for you as you come out, right? And so on the 14th day of that first year, you keep the Passover. That's when they kept the Passover the first time. It is now the 14th day, the first month of the second year. It's been 1 full year since they've come out of Egypt, probably closer to about 9 months since they come out of Sinai. Or they made it to Sinai, my mistake. Right? As Exodus 19 says, on the 3rd new moon, they made it to the mountain. So about 3 months. So about 9 months, we've been here at this one place. We're going to keep it according to all the statutes and rules. We think about those, if those we may be familiar with. If not, go back and look at Exodus 12, but here are the main ones, right? You're going to take a lamb, year-old male without blemish. You're going to select that lamb. You're going to keep it with you. Then you're going to slaughter it on the 14th day of the first month at twilight. I think the Hebrew actually means between the 2 evenings. So before dark, right before dark. You're gonna slaughter this lamb, and the very first one, you're to take the blood of that lamb and put it over the door, so when the destroyer comes through and sees that blood, it passes over the house. But that lamb is to be roasted, whole, eaten as a family, eaten being ready to leave, eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. No bones will be broken. Anything left over in the morning needs to be burned. Right? Those are kind of the basic things. So the people of Israel kept this. with this exception. Look right down at verse 6. Certain men who were unclean through touching a dead body, they couldn't keep the Passover. Right? Those who are unclean are not supposed to participate in certain activities. And so those men came to Moses and Aaron. And they said, we're unclean through touching a dead body. Does this mean we can't be part of this? Does this mean that we're not part of this now? I like Moses' answer. Wait. Let me ask God. This seems to be uncharted territory for Moses. The initial command doesn't talk about anybody who's not able. So what do we do with it? Well, he says, let me find out. This is not the only place we'll find when Moses reaches places like in areas where he's not really sure of going, well, wait, let's find out what God has to say. Right? Wait, I'll ask. That's what he does. And so there's an exception made. Right? There's an exception made. God says, okay, here's the deal. If you can't participate because of being away on a long journey, which seems odd, because this must be one that's going to be carried on over into when we get to Canaan, because I'm wondering, where are they going on a long journey right now, right? But if somebody is unclean through touching a dead body, or they're on a long journey, they'll still keep the Passover, just not with everyone else. They'll do it a month later. They'll do it on the 14th day of the second month. And they'll keep it just like the others did. They'll keep it just like the rest of Israel does. All those statutes are still in effect. But they're gonna do it at a different time. But he doesn't stop there. Because he makes a real emphasis on keeping this. We have the people who are going to keep this. We have others who can't keep this because they're ceremonially unclean. Then he says, but if anyone, right? But if anyone who is clean and not on a journey fails to keep the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people because he did not bring the Lord's offering at its appointed time. That man shall bear his sin. There's a couple of things I want to talk about in association with this. And the first one is this. When we talk about divine punishment, we talk about punishment for the people of God. There seem to be two different ones. I mean, there's several different ones, two categories maybe might be better. If you go back and you look at some of the laws in Leviticus, you look at some of the repercussions of breaking some of those laws, I think we'll find that there are two different things. There are those when he says they need to be put to death. Most of the time it's by stoning. In some rare instances, it's by stoning and by burning, and their bodies will be burned. I mean, that's really there. Put to death, not there to be executed. Or there's others where say they will be cut off from their people. Now, for a long time, and I'm still not sure that I'm 100% wrong in this, but for a long time, I've equated those two, right? And I think a lot of people equate those two because it makes sense to equate them, or at least it does to me. If you think of the idea of being cut off from their people, you have the tabernacle here, you have the camp, the whole community of Israel around, and if you are cut off and you are in the Sinai wilderness and you are excluded from that, then that would kind of point to the fact that you're not going to make it, right? The not having the protection, the support, the help, all of that stuff from the community around you, you're probably not going to make it. So I've always kind of thought those two to be the same, but I think they are a bit different because really we don't know exactly what cut off from your people means. It could be that, it could be excommunicated. It also could be that you're cut off as in your family line is cut off, right? That person will be cut off. So that could be premature death. It could be barrenness. It could be all kinds of things that could go along with that. But here's the major difference that I think that we see here. When we talk about people being put to death, this is something that is done by the community. stoned to death. The community does that. Right? This sin has been brought to the attention. This sin is known. This sin is going to be dealt with. You're going to put away this evil from among you. This is going to be done by the community. This one seems to be done by God. And there's some subtle things, and maybe I'm overreading this, and that's fine. Maybe you disagree with this, and that's okay too. But I want us to think about this. Typically when it talks about people being cut off, it's a sin that's committed that God alone knows, right? God and the person who committed it, right? God or the people involved. If someone, in this case, let's talk about being unclean. If someone comes in contact with a dead body and they're unclean, chances are not everybody knows that, right? I mean, there's a good possibility not everybody knows that. But not just dead bodies make people unclean. There's skin problems. There is emission of bodily fluids that make people unclean, that maybe not everybody's aware of, but God is. And if they go ahead and try to participate being unclean, God knows that and God will deal with it, right? And so I think there's a significant or a significant difference, right? Number one is we don't know exactly what cut off means, and that this is divine punishment handed out by God. I think about places where we think about being cut off, or in some cases, the wording's a bit different, but what Paul writes in Romans 9 through 11, when he's talking about Jews and Gentiles and their place in the kingdom, where he talks about the Gentiles being grafted in as wild olive branches, but the other ones being broken off because of disbelief. Doesn't mean they're dead physically, it just means they're not part anymore, right? But that's something that God takes care of, right? And that's the same kind of thing here. Well, I want to move on from that. It's just kind of something to think about. Second thing that I want us to kind of think about, and this is just more stuff for us to go, okay, I wonder what that means. What does that entail? Twice in this passage that Passover is mentioned as the Lord's offering. And I don't know what that means, okay? I'm just telling you, because as if we think back through the Passover, and we try to take Passover and we put it next to the offerings that we read about in Leviticus, either the burnt offering or the sin offering or the grain offering or the wave offering or the peace offering, right? These are things done in this way and offered, at least given to God in some form or fashion. In the Passover, it's a lamb that God has given, right? God has obviously provided this, but that lamb is taken, it's killed, it's eaten by these people. There doesn't seem to be any grand ritual around an altar, that this is dedicated to God in some way. I'm wondering if the offering that he talks about here, or the way that it's mentioned as offering, is the offering of thanks. The offering of acknowledgement as God is the one who delivered them. Right? I like to keep this here because it's a reminder as they go through the wilderness, right? Is they're the redeemed people of God, and the offering may be this worship of going, yes, it's God who brought us here. I don't think it's coincidence. I don't think it's coincidence that the timing of this. I don't think it's coincidence that God says, I want you to keep the Passover before we pull up stakes and move toward Canaan. People need to be reminded of who they are and how they got there. Right? They need to be reminded that it's God who delivered them. It's God who brought them here. It's God is the reason that they stand before him as his children. And this is just a reminder. It's the importance of knowing that where we've been helps to inform which way we're going. I think this is something that for a lot of my life I didn't quite get, especially as it comes to our worship now. Each week we gather and we participate in the communion, the Lord's Supper. We have example for that. We have that in the New Testament. It seems as if every first day of the week this is what they did. And so for a long time, it's been presented, and maybe not, that may not be fair, but a long time it's been presented, well, this is what they did, so this is what we do, without necessarily peeking behind the curtain and seeing why. That coming together and remembering God's deliverance, Jesus as our Passover lamb, as Paul would call him, right? Having that remembrance of who we are and whose we are as we move out our separate ways after that, right? And move on through life. And we come back together the next week to remember where we've been, who we were, right? We were slaves to sin, and God delivered us. God, through his great mercy, right, powerful acts of judgment and an outstretched arm, has saved us. And now we're his people, right? So I hope that kind of helps us. I hope that kind of helps us as we move forward each week, as we go, wait a minute, the Passover and Lord's Supper are connected in many ways. But this is one of those where it's a time where we go, this is who we are, and informs us how we move forward. Okay? I want to move on to the next little section, 15 through 23. I just want to read this because it's kind of easy to skip through, and we miss some of the things that I find fascinating. And again, you may not, but you always have fast forward as the option. Right? On the day that the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. And at evening it was over the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until morning. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day, the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, after that the people of Israel set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, there the people of Israel camped. And at the command of the Lord the people of Israel set out, and at the command of the Lord they camped. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the people of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was a few days over the tabernacle, and according to the command of the Lord, they remained in camp. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they set out. And sometimes the cloud remained from evening till morning. And when the cloud lifted in the morning, they set out. Or if it continued for a day and a night, when the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether it was 2 days, or a month, or a longer time, that the cloud continued over the tabernacle, abiding there, the people of Israel remained in camp and did not set out, but when it lifted, they set out. At the command of the Lord they camped, at the command of the Lord they set out. They kept charge of the Lord, and at the command of the Lord by Moses. Okay, if we didn't hear this cycle of listening and following, and listening and responding, and doing those kinds of things, then we need to read that again. But I don't want to subject you to that right now, right? But there's something important here, I think. This is a section in the book of Numbers that kind of indicates to me that this is not necessarily written for the people who are there at Sinai at the time. I think it really goes well with the fact that we celebrate Passover right before this little section is talked about. Because this is something that is going to be kept for future generations of going, how did we get here? How is it that we made it from Egypt to Sinai to Canaan? It's because of the Lord. The Lord guided us. And this is when we left, and this is when we stopped. When the cloud lifted, we moved. When the cloud stayed, we stayed. We did not move unless God did. And it's God who leads. This is just one of those things, and it speaks to me anyway as we read this, and I hear these words, going, this is something that's passed down. So when the ancestors, right, when those who come after, generations behind, go, how is it that we got here? Why are we in Canaan, right? Why is this our land? How did we get this? It's because God led us there. God delivered us. Right? God delivered us from Egypt, and God led us here. This is how we got here. God made a promise to Abraham, our father, and God kept it. And we're here because we followed God. And they might even go, wow, how did it take you so long? Because we followed God. And wherever he stopped, we stopped. And when he moved, we moved. I think it speaks to us of the importance of passing down faith. Another thing we see in here is the desire to wait on God, or the discipline of waiting on God. don't go until he does. Right? All right. So I want to move on from that. I want to go to chapter 10 really quickly, kind of look at a few things there. Again, we think, okay, we must be getting ready to go, but we stop again. We stop again for this narrative, or this instructions about the trumpets. There are 2 trumpets made. Make 2 silver trumpets of hammered work. You shall make them, and you shall use them for summoning the congregation and for breaking camp. That's the reason we have them. We have 2 of them. 2 silver trumpets, and they're going to be heard, and they're going to give direction as to when we go and when we come home. Right? When we go, where we go, who goes, right? All of this again is pointing to the lead of God. So it's used for summoning. If one of the trumpets is blown, and these are blown by the priests, if one of the trumpets is blown, that means only the chiefs, the heads of the tribes, are together at the tabernacle, at the tent of meeting. If both are blown, everybody comes. Right? Then when it comes time to break camp, when it comes time to move, an alarm is blown. I don't know what the cadence of this is. I don't know what the difference is, but obviously they do. Right? It's not really spelled out. I missed it if it's spelled out here in the text. Right? But when the alarm is blown, if it's blown once, those on the east side of the camp go. If it's blown twice, those on the south side of the camp go. I don't know about the east, the west. I don't know about them. I mean, I don't know about the west or the north. I'm assuming that we're supposed to pick up on the fact of going, okay, these people are moving, these people are moving. It must be time for this to move. It must be time for this to move. It must be time for us to move. Okay, right? But again, this is all part of time that we've spent with God at Sinai, the time that Israel has camped there and listened and learned what it's like to be holy people, what it means to approach a holy God, what it means to submit to the leadership of God. This is another one of those where God is saying, you listen for me. Right? Who blows the trumpets? The priests. How do they know? Because God's going to tell them. Right? God's going to communicate to them through Moses and Aaron, and he'll say, now it's time. And he'll say later, when it's time to go out into battle, you're going to blow this. When it's time for you to gather, when it's time for you to gather for festivals and special days, you're going to blow this and then people are going to come. It's listening for God and responding. It's listening. What did we hear? Did we just hear one? Well, then just part of us go. Did we hear both? We all go. We heard the alarm. That means these people go. When we hear it again, that means these people go. We go when God calls. And it's all training. I think much of this is training what it means to follow God, what it means for God to be in the lead. But we get this done. We have the trumpets are blown. We have the directions for how the trumpets are supposed to operate, and here we go. Right? If you've been through this, if you've been reading through the Old Testament and just trying to kind of track through there, from Exodus chapter 19 to Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, we are finally moving. Right? We are finally moving. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day, giving those people who missed Passover on the 14th day of the first month to participate in the second month. Now the 20th day, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of the Lord by Moses. There it is again. God moves and they move. God moves and they follow. They finally set out. It's going to go on through here. We're not going to read that section. You can read that, but it just gives the order in which they travel. And the order in which they travel is given back in Numbers chapter 2. This is where they're going to camp, and this is how they're going to lead out. I know that Judah is going to be in the front. I know that Dan is going to be in the back. And I know that those who carry the tabernacle are going to be in the middle. That those who have the frames of the tabernacle, those who have the coverings of the tabernacle are going to get there before the Kohathites who carry the holy things, because the tabernacle will be set up when they get there. And they will take it right in the tabernacle. But again, God is at the center, the God who has numbered them, counted them, organized them, and is now going to lead them, has them marching in his direction. At his direction. At the command of the Lord by Moses. And there it is. We listen and we respond. Now, before we get all out of chapter 10, I've got a couple of things that we need to see. So let's start in verse 29. It's kind of I find it a bit of an odd section, but you may not. Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we're setting out for the place which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us and we will do good to you, for the Lord has promised good to Israel. But he said to him, I will not go. I will depart to my own land and to my kindred. So that's Hobab speaking back to Moses. Moses again speaks to him. It says, he said, please do not leave us, for you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will serve as eyes for us. And if you do good with this, whatever good the Lord will do to us, the same we will do to you. Okay, I got to admit I struggle with this passage, and I don't struggle with it just by way of understanding, because it seems pretty straightforward, other than the fact of who is Hobab, or Hobab, or however we pronounce his name. There's a little bit of confusion. I don't know how much confusion, but I want to just kind of list these out, and then we'll talk about probabilities. So we got Reuel, and we have Jethro, and now we have Hobab. If you go back to Exodus, Reuel is mentioned as Moses' father-in-law. Jethro is mentioned as Moses' father-in-law. Right? Right? The daughters that come to the well, right? The daughters of Reuel. And so there's ways of going, okay, so who is this? Why the name change? And there's lots of efforts made to kind of think about this. And there's different ways, and many of them are very, very plausible. And I think really, they get quite possible. Okay, Jethro, priest of Midian. We find him again in Exodus, where he comes and he helps Moses and he gives him advice. And over in that chapter, he's referred to as Moses' father-in-law. I mean, and that just keeps repeating. I mean, to the point that you go, yeah, we got it. Right? But that's who he is. And so are Reuel and Jethro the same person? There are those that say yes, they are. Right? Yes, they are. Reuel is the man's name. Jethro is the name he wears as a priest. That would be plausible. There's also the idea that Jethro is actually Moses' father-in-law. Reuel is Moses' grandfather-in-law. We also find those kinds of things in Scripture too, where it says the son of. Jesus is referred to the son of David as the son of David. There's a lot of generations between David and Jesus, right? So sometimes it's just the head of the family, the patriarch's name is associated as the father of, right? The Jews of Jesus' day said, we have Abraham as our father. Right? So we kind of know what that means. So that's possible. As far as Hobab goes, and this is the first time that he's mentioned that I know of from Exodus forward. And it's a good possibility that who he is actually, and the wording in the ESV seems to indicate that he's Moses' brother-in-law. Not mentioned any other place leading up to this. So, going, are these all three the same person that just called different names? Are these two the same? Are they not the same? That's a great conversation to have, and it's a really great thing if we're going to kind of try to dig into and see if we can find out. But really, that's not the point of the story. I don't believe that to be the point of the point being made here. Other than just trying to kind of gather and kind of get in my head who this person is. The other thing that confuses me is this. In chapter 9, we've had all of this about this is God who leads, right? When God says go, this is where we go. And where God stops, that's where we stop. And God knows where he's leading Israel, and so they just follow him. But in this situation, Moses calls on somebody else to help lead them. We need you, he says. For you know where we should camp. Does this mean that God doesn't? Right? And so I take that as a bit of a shock coming from Moses. But the other thing that almost is equally shocking at some level is that God seems to be okay with this. God says, sure. Let me give you what I think about this. You can feel free to disagree, but I think this is a great illustration of the value of people around us. I think God knows that we need people around us. Remember the idea of being cut off from the community? It is being God's people together as they live together, they travel together, they worship together, they serve together, all of these things. This idea of togetherness. I want to kind of move this into something, and again, you may disagree with this, and that's okay. I think what we see here is the value of people who've been in situations where we haven't. I think this is part of the beauty of being the family of God. We're going to get into situations within our lives in which we have never navigated. Places we've never camped. Right? We've never been here before. I'm going to give you an example, and it's a rather personal one, and it's not meant for anything else but just to illustrate this point. And about 18 years ago, Stacy and I suffered the loss of a child. We're expecting a son. He was to be born in July, and we lost him in February. That's territory we'd never navigated before. There were people within this congregation, there were people outside of this congregation who'd been there. And they were a tremendous help. They were a tremendous help to go, wait a minute, we've camped here before. Here's the places you need to stay away from. Here's places you need to go. Their advice was invaluable. We have people who have experienced many things in life that the rest of us haven't. And they've learned by camping in the wilderness. I'm going, hey, this is probably where you should go. You should stay away from there. This is a hard thing for us right now whenever we're all apart. But I think this shows the value of being together, of communicating with one another, lifting one another up, of knowing what's going on in one another's lives, and doing life together, because we find people who have been in situations where we have not. But we find ourselves strangers in a strange land, and they go, listen, yeah, I know, I camped there once. This is where you go, and this is where you don't. Reach out. Reach out and share your experiences. That's my encouragement. Is that we reach out and we share our experiences with one another, because we may have gone through something and said, no, listen, I camped over there and that's a bad place to be. I wish I had been over here. Right? But we help one another through the wilderness. That's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to finish with this. Whenever the ark set out, Moses said, arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. When it rested, he said, return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel. This sounds to me, and again, this is just what it sounds like to me. This sounds like an announcement that would be made as the king gets up to go somewhere, as the king moves, right? As the king returns home. Oh, return home to the thousands of Israel, or let your enemies flee before you. I could, as I look through different commentaries that I read going along with the book of Numbers, there's really nothing that I found that just said, hey, this is an ancient Near Eastern, proclamation of the coming of the king. But it sounded like that to me. It sounded reasonable. But I think what it is more so than that is just the acknowledgement of what we've seen so far, and the acknowledgement of what we've talked about as one of the major themes of this book, is that this is God's lead. God's going to lead them to battle. God's going to lead them home. God's going to stop, and they're going to gather with him. And this is just that acknowledgement that Moses has in the hearing of all of Israel to say, this is the one who leads you. This God who led you out of Egypt with mighty acts of judgment and an outstretched arm is still the God who's going to lead you now. Let your enemies flee before you. Let your enemies be scattered. And return to the thousands of Israel. It's an acknowledgement of God's leadership and God's kingship. And maybe one that we should talk about more often and think of more often. Are we waiting and watching for God? Are we people who have been delivered and are waiting for God to lead? Are listening for God to summon us? Are leaning on one another in the kingdom to help us navigate places where we've never camped before, and continuing to acknowledge who God is as our King? That's all I've got. I hope that this has been beneficial. Again, comments are welcome on the Facebook page or on the YouTube section where you can comment there. Have comments, questions, tell me I'm crazy, whatever. But thanks again for engaging in this study. Let's pray to close. Father, we thank you so much. Thank you so much for the ways that we can continue to connect even though we're physically distant. Father, we're thankful for the word that you've given to us, the example of who you are and how you deal with your people. Father, we're thankful for the deliverance that we have because of what you've done through your Son. Father, we want to be your people. We want nothing more than to be your people, and hopefully, Father, help us to settle for nothing less than being who you've called us to be. Help us to listen for your call. Help us to follow your lead, remember our deliverance, and to lean on one another. Father, help us as we acknowledge you as the King. We love you. We're thankful for all that you've done in our lives. We're thankful for all that you continue to do. Help us to be attentive to your work and to follow where you'd have us to go. We love you so much, and we're so thankful for Jesus, and it's in his name that we pray.